Good afternoon, everyone from Tokyo. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Ralph De Haas. Professor Ralph De Haas is a director of research at European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and also a professor of finance at KU Leuven, one of the premier institutes in Belgium. His research focuses on financial development, banking, and the impact of finance on farmers and households. Today, we'll speak on how will aging population reshape the global economy. This is very timely topic. Many countries, including those in Asia, are facing rapid demographic change. In fact, Asian Development Bank Institute has recently released a podcast titled How Demographics Are Redefining Asia's Future, highlighting the growing importance of this issue. We are very pleased to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming Professor De Haas. With this, I hand over the floor to you.
Do I need to unmute myself, or is this?
No, you have not to do it.
Then your speaker needs to be muted.
He's doing it. Unmuted.
No, the speaker, not your microphone.
Yeah.
There we go.
So everyone can hear me now.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Very good. Well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction and for being here in person. Right. So what I would like to do indeed is to walk you briefly through the 2025-26 transition report. So for those who are in the room, there are physical copies here. But you can also go to www.ebid.com and you can always download the latest information. Okay, so the report is somewhat cheaply called Brave Old World in reference to the novel Brave New World. And as you can see, we're going to talk about the world of work. We're going to talk about automation. We're also going to talk more broadly about demography in the countries where EBD is operating. So the transition report is our flagship publication. It's published every year, always on a very different topic. But what's a constant across years is that we have 4 main thematic chapters, and then there's a 5th chapter on structural reforms. So I will walk you through some of the charts and findings that I personally find most interesting. But if you are interested in more detail, it's all available, including all technical. Okay, so let's start with the first chapter, which is about demographic trends and how these are impacting economic growth, and in particular how they are impacting achieving the per capita development. So I think these first 2 slides are just to set the scene, but I think they are important to keep in mind in the rest of the talk. So what this is showing basically is how what we call currently developing, of course, in some of these countries were also developing, but they are now richer countries in the world, how they basically developed in terms of median age. So you see that in the past 70 years or so, in Western Europe, the US, I think Japan is also in here, also separately here. You can see that as these countries grew richer, often very rapidly grew richer, they also became much older societies, right? So you can see that in these countries as a whole, this group of countries as a whole, between 1950 and 2020, the median age went up from about 30 to slightly to 40. So there's quite rapid increase. Now, you see a very similar development in many of the countries where the EBRD is active, Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And you see that the slope is sort of similar. But the difference, of course, is that this process is happening at a time that these countries are still relatively poor. Right? So this is where this idea of getting old before you're getting rich comes from. So these countries are not only lagging in terms of how they are doing in terms of age structure, but they're also doing this at a at a point in time where they are still relatively young. Of course, that's important because as societies age, and they have to, the people who are working have to pay for increasing numbers of non-working people. That's of course easier. That's difficult for everyone, and it's relatively easy to do so if you are an affluent, relatively affluent society. If you're relatively poor, then it becomes even more challenging. So I think that's very important point that we try to make with this report. Then there are two other regions where the EBD has been operating since quite a bit of time, also in the past decade or so, which is what we call the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean or Northern Africa, where you see, of course, that there's also aging going on, but at a much lower level. And then there's Sub-Saharan Africa, where the EBD has been working since this year. So this is a very new region for us. And as you can see here, this is, of course, a part of the world or a continent that is really characterized by still very, very young populations, right? So more than half of the people in Sub-Saharan Africa, even in the countries where EBD is operating at this point in time, is actually below 20 years. It's incredibly young and dynamic part of the world. And so we think that this is a potential source of additional growth for the next couple of years, but this is not going to be automatic. It's not really absolutely, yes.
You can go back to the chart. Yes. So it's quite interesting to see how the post-communist trend is kind of like different from the rest, except for South Africa, of course. Is there any particular explanation for that linear rather than non-linear trend that we see in other cases?
So are you talking about the 1990s
one?
Yeah, the blue one.
Also in 1990s. If you take a line from 1950s to 2020, in that blue line, you get a rather linear kind of trend.
Yeah.
Well, if you go for the advanced economies, Japan, or even the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean, you see a non-linear.
Yes. Yes. So this is a reflection of earlier differences in birth cohorts, basically, and so partly in the 1990s. So this is where you see this reversal. So basically, what you see in the 1990s is a period when there was a big output gap in so a drop in output, drop in production. So we basically countries itself going further to the right, they actually went to the left. And at the same time, there is basically no further there's no further increase in sort of the demographic pattern. But you're right, in particular in Japan, for instance, you see there's this non-linear process. So one of the reflection of, I already mentioned some of the differences in birth cohorts, but also you see that Japan has been a country that has been very successful in really extending longevity, right? So people are getting, compared to other countries, much older here. So that is one of the reasons why this is showing up in some countries that have been particularly successful in extending lifespans is where you would see these almost non-linear changes. That has not been happening in some of many countries of post-communist. That's a big about Russia would be an example where average age has gone up, but at the top of the distribution. So now this isn't going to be a similar chart as the one that I've just shown you before, but now not looking at median age, but total. So here we can even go a bit further back in time. So again, we're looking at countries that are now called developed, but of course, when we go back to 1870, there was industrializing developing countries. And you can see that during that process of development, it's a bit of a bumpy road, but you see very clearly that there has been a very gradual, very persistent decline in fertility, here measured as the number of births per woman. So on average, in the 1870s, if you look at the advanced economies, the average woman would still have about 5 kids. That has gone down now over time to slightly below 2. Now, this number is, of course, important because the replacement rate is about 2.1, 2.2, depends on where you are in the world, but let's say 2.1. So that means that in advanced economies, we now see that the replacement rate is the birth rate is actually below. If you look globally, if you do this exercise globally, you see that 2 out of 3 people globally are now living in a country where the birth rate is below. You can have Japan here as well as one of the countries that's part of that orange line. And you see here, of course, that the drop in recent decades has supposedly even stronger. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. With very low fertility levels. And then again, we have the EBRD post-communist countries, where you see that they are reducing fertility, and they are basically seeing a shrinkage in many cases of their total population, but they are doing that at a much lower income level. Of course, the shrinking of population in those countries is partly related to the fact that fewer children are being born, but also, and even to a much larger extent, because many people are leaving at least some of these countries, right? So they're emigrating to the west. So you have countries like Bulgaria, for instance, very large parts, but there's been a very strong drop in total population, mostly because people are emigrating to Western Europe. And then again, we can look at climate. So much younger, as we already discussed, part of the world, but here as well, you see actually quite strong declines in very steep declines in number of kids. And then even if you go to sub-Saharan Africa in the past 50 years or so, you see that there as well there has been a drop in fertility. Now, of course, this is from a higher level, right? So they started at a level of about seven kids per woman. But you can see that this drop is actually very sharp as well. So I think since it's such a large, not only geographically, but also in terms of population part of the world, a lot of the future of demography on a global level will actually be determined by how this green line is going. Right. So if this curve would flatten, then we would see it would take much longer before the global population is going to be stabilized. But if it continues like this, we would actually see depopulation happening really quite soon, after which global population slowly starts to decline. I'm going to skip this because that's over. What I want to show here is basically, what I talk about here is basically what we call these demographic headwinds, right? So this is basically the idea that if you have all the populations and you have a smaller part of your population working, then that automatically means just because there's fewer people working, but they have to feed still a large population, that GDP per capita is going. That's not a mechanical reason why all the populations are becoming less productive. There are other reasons as well. If you have more older people, you tend to become less innovative as a country, and that may weigh on GDP per capita as well. I think the main part that we stress here is more sort of mechanical part, that just because there's fewer people working, there's less production on a per capita. And so when we look at that in these data in a bit more detail, for many of our countries of operation, that is about 0.4 percentage points of a headwind on an annual basis, right? So on an annual year-by-year basis, these countries between now and 2050 would have been growing by about 0.4 percentage points faster if it had not been for this demographic headwind. So it's this shrinking of the workforce session. And that's basically what I'm showing you here with these orange dots. So the historical data are in blue bars, and what we project for the next 25 years is basically showing here in these orange dots. And so you can see that in some countries like Korea on the right is of course an extreme example. You can really see that the shrinking of the Korean population is having a really big impact on GDP per capita. And Japan is of course another circle that is of course another country. So then the question is, and so we talk about at length in the report about this. The question is how can countries try to counterbalance that, right? So if you have fewer people that are working in the workforce, but you still have a quite large population that you need to support, how can you handle that? And there's a couple of recipes. I think if there's one takeaway message from this report is that there's no one silver bullet. So I don't think there's one policy mechanism that you can really activate in order to counterbalance this. But there's a bit of a menu of options that you can choose from as a society, depending on what your preferences are. And by combining some of these messages, you can at least try to counterbalance this. So let's go through those quickly and see what the various reports find. So one option, of course, would be if there's fewer people working or fewer people able to work in your society because they are getting older, you can import young people from elsewhere. Right? Of course, not everyone can do that at the same time because there's a limited amount of people that are on the planet, or that at least are willing to migrate. But there is a large group of people willing to migrate to rich countries. So if you tap into that pool, that is in principle a nice way, or potentially useful, productive way of getting more productive population. Now, when we crunch the numbers, what we see is that the numbers that would need to be imported, if you will, right? So the import migration that you would need to have to completely offset that demographic headwind is actually going to be very low. It will be larger than the percentage increases in migration that we've seen in recent years in the UK, in Germany, in Australia, and in Canada, right? And so we know that in those countries, these migration flows have often been met by resistance. There have been objections raised by large parts of the population. So this is not a smooth process. So you can have all kinds of thoughts about that towards not just justified. But we do know that there's a limit to what societies can tolerate in terms of income migration. And I think the numbers that we will be looking at to completely offset this demographic headwind are much larger than what we've seen historically. And so basically we are the orange bars versus the blue bars is basically two scenarios. So you can think about types of immigrants, you can think about guest workers. So in the calculations that we do, these are basically people that you import, as a form of better word, you're allowed to enter the country. They work there, and then when they age, when they become, let's say 65 years of age, they leave the country. And in the meantime, they don't have any children on their own, right? So that's in a way, a very efficient way of making use of their labor. You use the labor, but then when they get older, they get back to the country where they came from. Or you can have another method, which is basically let people come to your country and then naturalize them in a way, which also means that they will locally have children, which then reduces the impactfulness a little bit of that measure. Because then, of course, you get a younger part of the population who, at least for the first, let's say, 20 years, 15 to 20 years, themselves are not productive. And you have to support as a society. So this is a slightly less efficient way, if you will, of importing. In both scenarios, the numbers would really need to be very low. So in countries that are open, where the society is open, where citizens, where voters are open, in principle, to some migration, this can be part of the solution, but we think it's unlikely to be completely offsetting.
Yes, clarify. So please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So the way we read this is that for Korea, for example, the country in 2024 to 2050 needs 5% point more migration than the
it would need 5 percentage points of the current population.
Yeah.
So you would need to absorb an additional 5% of the exact. Yeah, that's it.
instead of that 0 point something average.
Yes, but yes, so you compare it to the white diamond, right?
Right.
So that is sort of the historical average. So that's what Korea would be used to. And then you would have to have, almost 10 times more than that in order to completely get rid of it.
And if Korea is going to opt for guest workers kind of scenario, they only need about this small.
Korea, or you mean Japan? Maybe? Sorry,
It's Korea. It's the one.
Oh, exactly. Yes, sorry. That is the blue bar.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yes. This is a bit of visually not very nice because the bars are cut. But yeah.
But how is it smaller than the requirement for migration?
Um,
After they product the productive age workers that are going to be imported should be similar in terms of.
Let me, I think that's the difference between the longer term and the shorter term. Now I'm getting confused myself. Right. All right, no, sorry. So the blue, sorry, I was confused. So when you have the the guest workers,
Yeah.
then those numbers are lower, right? So that's the case in Korea as well, right? So you have 2 versus 5. So the idea here is that if you have non-guest, so like regular immigration, then suppose a lot of guest workers would come to Korea. But they would stay, they would work there, but they would be treated as average citizens. So in the model, that means that somewhere they get old themselves, so they become part of the problem. And before they do that, they will have children themselves, and so during the, let's say, first 15 to 20 years of those children, of the lifetime of those children, the working population would also have to take care of those children. Right? And so because of those, so in a way, having the guest worker scenario is a very efficient way of getting foreign labor, because you say you're only allowed in the country when you actually work, and you don't have these inefficient kids, and once you're done working, you go back. And Germany has tried that in the past. Holland, I'm from Holland, has tried that in the past. Of course, it's very difficult if people have been working in your country for many years to send them back, back home. And the Dutch people are one of many of the migrants who wouldn't want that. So, but this is sort of a theoretical exercise.
So if I understood correctly, the guest worker scenario would be like something, I don't know, like, for example, like from Nepal and this, like we're possible.
You work,
No, like for example, the migration to middle, the Mediterranean countries like Arab and Emirates, I think those could be the kind of guest workers, because they go there in their very active age, right? From the age of 80, they go there, and then like 45, 50,
And they yeah, that's one. I mean, another model would be, which I think a lot of countries are currently experimenting with, is more just like a circular migration. So you have people going to the Middle East from Southeastern Asia to the Middle East, for instance. They work for a couple of years in their productive period, and then they go back, and then they may come back later in life, or the family member may go, but I think the effect is the same, right? Is if you only have people in their productive age in your country, and before that and after that, they go back to.
How did your country did that in the past? Do you design a contract visa or something?
No, I think in Holland, there was always there was sort of implicit this idea that people would come to Holland. Initially, they would also not bring any family members, so that would be the idea that they would return back to. In our case, it would be mainly Morocco and Turkey, where people came from. To a lesser extent, Spain and Italy. But then, of course, and the idea was also for a long time that there were very few programs, or if any, to try to integrate those people into your society, because always the idea was that they would go back. So why would you offer Dutch lessons, right? So I think at some point it became clear that a lot of these people actually, they didn't just want to work in Holland, they also wanted to stay, that they were getting on a case-by-case basis, but increasingly also moving their family to Holland. So that was basically gradually the move from the blue bar scenario to the orange bar scenario, which was not really the envisaged policy, but so it gradually it moved in that. As I said, I think it's very difficult to have that pure guesswork approach, unless you do it in a more circular way, because then you sort of rotate different people every couple of years, and the attachment of people to your country is going to be as strong. All right. So bottom line here, I think, is that this can be part of the solution if a country would be open to that, but for sure not a complete solution. And that this is basically what I was just great. So the second option, of course, is what everybody is talking about these days. Is you can sort of, as a sort of a Hail Mary, you can think, well, maybe we don't even need to worry about this, because we have fewer workers in our country. But they're going to use AI and they're going to become these super productive, super smart employees. And because of that, we need to grow much less. Well, of course, one criticism you can have is that a lot of jobs cannot be, improved by AI. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But even if you just look at the average impact that people have estimated, the average impact of AI on the productivity in specific sectors and in specific when doing specific tasks, you find quite large differences in how people think about these productivity gains. But even if you take the extremes of that, which is what we're doing here, so we look at a high scenario and a more skeptical scenario, the orange one. In both of these scenarios, in most countries, you can see that you cannot completely offset the cost of aging, right? And so there are a few countries on the right where, like Sweden, Finland, Great Britain, Denmark, if you are very bullish about the productivity gains coming from AI, so the blue dots, that actually may help to offset some of the, or most of completely the habits coming from them. Those are only a handful of countries. In most countries, it will be very difficult.
That's the difference.
So Bali is the underlying age structure. So like basically saying, look at Spain and Italy, for instance, right on the left. Those are countries where we see very rapid aging. And as you can see as well, is that the productivity gains of AI are sort of similar across countries. There is some variation depending on the sectoral composition of your economy, but there's not too much difference. So it will work in countries where you think that the aging problem is not as big, but in Spain and Italy, for instance, which are rapidly aging countries, it's just the gap is just too big to plot what it seems to be. Okay. So we've had work migration, we've had boosting productivity through AI or other innovation measures. So what we look at is a third measure, which is basically working longer, so retiring later, thus meaning that, or having a larger part of your population being part of the employment process. So when I say, there are relatively few, the society is aging and there are fewer people working, we do see that in many countries there's almost like a hidden reservoir of people, namely the female part of the population, that for various reasons is not or very incompletely engaged in the economic process. So we could imagine that in a society that is very rapidly aging and there's a scarcity of labor, if you could only get a large part of the female population, engaged in the productive part of the economy or the data productive part of the economy, that might have an impact. And we actually show that in various countries that impact can actually be quite large. But this is what would happen if you compare the diamonds, the white diamonds, to the blue bars. That gap is basically what would happen if you wouldn't do anything in terms of employment to population ratio. So you can see that in most countries there's a decline, right? So there are fewer employment to population ratios going down. Now, if you then think about including a larger part of your female population in the economic process, that can make a big difference. So you can see that that in particular makes a big difference in what yes. So like in Jordan and Egypt, for instance, and in Kosovo as well, in Tunisia, so those are the countries all the way on the left. Those are countries where very few women are working. So just by making better use of their productive capacity, you can actually really solve part of the problem. Also, I should point out that in those countries, you can see that the difference between the diamond and the blue line is very limited, because these are not the most rapidly aging countries in the next 25 years. Aging will only start after about 2050. And India would be another good example from your region. So if you look at the comparator part on the right, second bar from the left, you see that for India there will be a massive gain if female labor force participation will go on. And then on top of that, you can also that you have longer working lives. So basically try to gradually increase the retirement age. And that can give you an additional. And there's a whole discussion in the report about how to make sure that people have longer productive, healthy working lives. How you can incentivize them to stay engaged in the workplace for more. Yeah, please.
So in the report, is there any discussion about what type of work does women working? Because the way I see this is like, for example, a lot of women in Japan are working part-time,
Yes.
receiving like usually like say, for example, like administrative work rather than.
Yes, I will talk about that. Yeah, I think that's a good, I mean, the question we had, I presented this yesterday in the Ministry of Finance. We had a very interesting conversation there as well about the role of norms. So some of the female economists there, they were saying, well, you're not talking about norms, what we can do in an economy here is very different from what men can do. Maybe not because there are different rules, but there's just different expectations. So that is of course very important. But also I think the type of jobs that are available in an economy make a difference. We'll talk a little bit about this. All right. Then one thing I would point out here is that, and as you will see, there's quite, I would say, limited analysis of sub-Saharan Africa in this report. There is some, but for us, it's also a very new part of the world that we're still learning about. But one thing that in sub-Saharan Africa, of course, is very important is the fact that this is a very, very young continent. Actually, we operate very, very young in particular. And that means that as these very young cohorts go sort of on stream, if you will, and they become part of the workforce in principle, that can give them what we call a demographic dividend. So it means that because there's more shoulders, there are more people working, there's more production to be distributed per capita. So just like we had a demographic headwind, in these countries will have that dividend, which coincidentally turns to be on average to over 4%. I think the thing that I want to highlight here is that this is not an automatic process. Of course, what is automatic is that these very young people will hopefully mature and become of working age. Whether there's a job for them to take at that point in time is, of course, not an automatic process. So I think this slide is, in that sense, a little bit worrying. In the sense that we see that in particular in very young societies, large groups of all people, I think it's between, I have to check it, 15 and 24, are actually not involved in paid work or in education or in any form of training. So they appear to be completely outside of any form of either educational trajectory or forward. And that may create difficulties when people get older and may not automatically become productive members of society that we hope them to be in order to contribute to over the economy.
Is it the case where countries with younger population are countries that is less developed and hence they have less educational institutions and so
that is part of the problem, I would say. But I think you even see this in countries like Egypt, for instance. I was looking for Egypt, which is sort of you at 25 median age, you go up, right? And Jordan is there as well. So those are countries that have a pretty decent, in principle, educational system. A lot of people have tertiary education in Egypt as well. But at the same time, there's a large mismatch between the type of education that people get and what is actually demanded in work for these, right? So a lot of programs that we do in Egypt and Jordan, for instance, all about involving employers in training, vocational training in particular, because there are large groups of young people finishing a university with a university degree and then finding that they don't have the skills that are actually being asked in the country. So yes, but of course, if you go further to the left, you will indeed see that there are countries where it's not because people are not interested in having education, just because the educational system is either not present or it's too expensive for large parts of the population. Okay, and then this slide, I think is just to highlight, I mean, a lot of people talk about retirement age. So I think having a retirement age on the books is very important, right? So a clear endpoint of your working life. And also for the government to have set clear expectations about when that is going to be. In many countries that are making reforms in that area, we actually see that that's very important to communicate, is very transparent. So like in Holland, for instance, every couple of months, there's an additional month added to people's working. So you know exactly, if I was born in 1976, I know that by the time I retire, I can retire at 66.5 years old. But if you are born in 1980, you know that your retirement date will actually be 67 or 67.5. And I think that kind of transparency is very, very so that's one thing. The other thing which we're showing here is that actually in many countries, like Greece is sort of interesting all the way on the left. There's a huge gap in the case of Greece, about 10 years between, well, the legal, the official retirement ages and when people de facto stop. So again, if you want to talk about the implications of an aging society and you look at retirement age, that's good, but you really need to look at de facto retirement age, is not just what's this one. That's the main point you're trying to make. Okay, let's talk a little bit about fertility. As I said, there are four chapters in the report, and I'm going to talk mainly about the first two ones. So as you know, in many countries, and I would say in particular here in Asia, Japan, Korea, of course, is one of the Koreas, is definitely one of the more extreme countries. There's a lot of worry, maybe some of it justified, about the fact that the birth rate is below the international level, very, very strongly before, which means that societies are shrinking, populations are shrinking. Often, if you get very close to birth rate of about 1 or just above it, meaning that within a generation there is almost a halving of human population. And so we try to understand a little bit what's behind that. And so one thing where you can start is basically looking at marriage rates, which is what we're doing here. So we do see that if you look at generation, so baby boomers versus Generation X versus millennials and Gen Z, you see that each generation there seems to be a reduction in the percentage of people that at a certain age is now, when you then look further in the data, you can see that has an impact in some countries on fertility rates. In particular, in those countries where it's basically the norm is that you shouldn't have children out of wedlock. In other countries, like Scandinavian countries or Holland for that matter, you don't see that relationship. We do see that in Holland, fewer people are getting married, but a lot of people have kids outside of marriage, so they have a long-term relationship with a partner and they have kids, but they just don't get married. So it's not necessarily that there's this one-to-one relationship, but in countries where these norms that you can only have kids within a marriage are very strong, combined with fewer people marrying, of course, that then translates into fewer people, fewer new people being. And that's something that we see quite strongly in the data. So this is the mean age at childbirth. So of all children, not just the first one, but all children that born in the household. So if you look at the comparator countries for the picture, I think is the clearest. You see if you compare the situation in the 1970s, so the blue dots, to 1990s, the red dots, and then 2023, the diamonds. You see that the age at which women have their child is going up quite significantly. And again, if you look at Korea, it's a clear outline. But also countries like Spain, Italy, Japan, as well, France, Germany, you see very strong increases, as in particular in countries where bigger parts of the female population are becoming highly educated, often more highly educated men. Very see that at university population in many countries, and are part of the workforce and actually have a serious chance of having a very good career, real competitors of men, if you will, in the career place. You can see that once these prospects open up, they will either not have children or they will have children at a later age. Of course, when you have children at a later age, combined with biological limitations, with talk about that in a second. As well, you can see that there often is also fewer children.
How do we interpret those that has lower age?
Yeah, so there's a few countries I'm looking for, Kazakhstan, for instance. Yes, there are a couple of, this is mainly, so there's a box in the report about Kazakhstan and a number of Tajikistan, I think, as well, where these are overall countries with a an ethnic makeup that is where you have different ethnic groups in the country. And in particular, in Kazakhstan, for instance, you have ethnic Kazakhs and you have Russians. And so what you've seen in the, if you look at the period that we look at, is that there has been a shift in the composition of the country. So fewer Russians, more Kazakhs. Kazakhs tend to have a higher birth rate. And so just because of that composition, you see that the average birth age is actually growing. It's growing. So there are not, it's not so much about, you know, changes within these populations, it's just that there's a different composition of the country in terms of the average profile. Yeah, that is positive. It's thanks for pointing that out. But that is so in countries where that are not very homogeneous, that these compositional effects can be quite large. But here we look at first birth. So and you see very similar picture. So the when women to become a mother, that is increasing. So look at Greece, just because it's on all the way on the left. So you see in the 1990s, Greek women, when they became a mother, when they become a mother for the first time, that was about age 25. Currently, it's about 31. Okay, so you can see that happening in many other countries as well. So what's interesting is I think this is a very simple chart, and I quite like it. So what we did is we took all the countries in the world for which we had data and then grouped them in 10 buckets from poorest to richest, so from left to right. And then we used data on from the demographic and health survey, basically asking people how many kids would you like to or are you planning to have, and how many kids do you have. And then so what you see is in very poorest countries, so in the bottom two deciles, you see that people actually end up in many cases with more children than they actually wanted. At least that's what they say to me. So this may actually be an underestimate. And that's of course because in those countries it's difficult to get anti-conception on birth control measures, and so it's easy to end up with more children maybe. Then if you go to the richer countries, you actually see that many people actually end up with fewer kids than they would have wanted to have. And you see that gap between desired fertility and realized fertility. The interesting part here, I think, is that if you draw this line at 2.1, the replacement rate, you see that this desired fertility is actually above it. The realized fertility is below it. So this inability of people to properly, you know, get to the average number of kids that they actually want to have is sort of what pushes them below the replacement. Yes, please.
I don't think whether you have an answer, but I'm just asking. I'm just thinking like, what is the desire like after giving birth on the first child or before?
Oh, okay. I can know from, I don't know kids, but I know from my friend that that can vary a lot, right? Yeah. So some people they can't wait until they get the second or the third. And I also know, so my parents, for instance, I'm an only child. So I think when they had the first, I was like, no, this is enough. I think there's a lot of I don't know. I'm not sure whether we could get this from the data. I don't know whether we know whether there's a link between desired fertility overall and the previous number of children that you had. That would be very interesting. I don't think I will have to check that. I don't know the data well. But that would be interesting to see. And that in turn may very much depend also on the institutional framework of the country. Right? If you have your first child in Sweden with fantastic childcare and all of that, you might think about having a second child. But if you have your first child in, well, let's say Germany, where which is also a rich country, but where norms are very different, childcare is not as nicely arranged as in Sweden, it might be less attractive, in particular for women, to consider having a second child. And so the negotiation dynamics within the household, if you look at it from different. And that's all based just on economic considerations, not even also the cultural aspects. Good. And so what you see is that, the other way of looking at this is basically the number of children, the number of first-time births. So this is basically the proportion of women that never have a child, so never become mothers, versus sort of the extensive margin effect, which is higher order birth, which are the red parts here. And so you see that varies. So for instance, Romania stands out. I don't know why this is, but you see that in the period that we look at, there's, for instance, an increase in the percentage of Romanian women that actually become a mother. But at the same time, you see that the number of kids that they have conditional on having kids is actually going down. So the extensive margin going up, intensive margin going down. But in most, this is the outlier, right? So in most countries, you see that both the extensive margin and the intensive margin is going down. So what you have is a situation where, in particular, if you look at the cohorts born after the 1970s, quite large proportions of women decide not to have children. And so Poland, for instance, you see about 1 in 5 women just not becoming a mother at any point in time. Japan, it's almost a third of women who I'm loath to say decide to not have children because that decision is made not in isolation, it's made within an institutional and cultural framework. So in Japan at the moment, 28% of all women, given the institutional and cultural environment that they live in, make the decision not to have any children, which is almost a doubling as compared to what we saw in the 1950s, 1960s. So that is, I think, that's quite interesting. You see something similar, for instance, in Spain, right? So there's also a very strong increase in Spain. So interesting. I'm just wondering how much time I have left, so I can time a little bit and my time. Do you know?
We still have 15 minutes.
We will have some time for questions maybe at the end as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let me. I'm going to be very selective and just pick my favorite charts and talk a little bit about that. So this is not one. This is not one of them. This is basically showing that as you get older as a woman, this is purely based on biology. It becomes just more difficult to get to a certain number. So by the time of, if you're 35 and you start having children, the probability that you will end up with 4 children is basically pretty much 0. But you still have a very high chance, about 80% of having 1 child. So that's sort of some of the biological mechanisms that is causing basically this upward shift in age to have an impact on the total number of children. There's a and of course we talk a little bit about culture, and one way I think in which that culture manifests itself is in what we call motherhood penalties, or sometimes called child penalties, which like particularly term. So we call it motherhood penalty, but it basically means that when women become mothers as compared to men becoming fathers, there's a big difference. That is not a gender neutral impact on your career, your salary, your working hours, and all. That the process that behind that is very complex. It's about intra-household decision making and optimization. And I think there's maybe in the discussion later on we'll talk about more about it. The fact is that if you look at countries like Georgia, Czechia on the left, or if you look at the advanced Europe to Germany or Spain, for instance, you see that women get penalized much more than men when they become parents, in terms of their immune response. We talk a bit in the report about whether there are measures that governments can take to boost fertility rates, so pro-natal policies, as often called. And I think the bottom line here is that sometimes this works, but if it works, it doesn't work for long. It doesn't work a lot, and it's also very expensive. I think that's a good. And where it often matters is that it entices people to have children slightly earlier, but then the total number of children they actually will not necessarily increase. So it may not these may not be the most efficient ways of incentivizing people. What works much better, and again, there's more in the report about this, is having decent arrangements for childcare. Having paternity leave, and not only maternity leave, and also engaging with men that they also actually take it into. From countries like Japan, but also Spain, for instance, there's research showing that very hesitant to take paternity leave because it's considered to be bad for their career prospects. I think there's a lot of change that needs to happen there to make that much more normal. Okay, and then maybe a few slides. I'm going to skip chapter 4 altogether, but I want to show a few slides about this chapter in particular, because there was a question earlier on about the type of jobs that men and women are engaged in. So one of the things that we do in the report is basically think about different jobs in an economy. And one of the there's a nice article in for 2022 where they basically calculate what they call age-friendly jobs, which are jobs where there's a high degree of flexibility, and there are low demands in terms of physical strength. So that makes them in principle more appropriate for people who are getting older. And so what we see here is that in most countries there has been an increase in the availability of jobs like that. And of course, that's part of just the general deindustrialization process with service sector jobs becoming more common. And many of these, not all, but many of these service sector jobs are actually what we call age-friendly. So they're flexible, by less physical. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that indeed, if you look at the data who are in the jobs, see that older people, because they are age-friendly, tend to self-select into those jobs more. But we also see that many women, regardless of age, are actually present in those jobs. And of course, that links to a whole literature on women, in particular mothers, that have to combine working life with not only children, but also in many cases elderly parents. In order to sort of keep track of all of that at the same time, you need to have a relatively flexible job. And so we see that in particular tertiary educated women are actually selecting into these more age-friendly jobs as well. So that was a bit unexpected when we started looking into it, but thinking about it, I think it makes a lot of sense. But if for all the people, this flexibility is important, but for people that have to juggle, many more roles in their lives than men have, this may be
What are these age-friendly jobs? Economist is one of the best books.
Depends. I think I don't know. So in my case, I would have I think I have a pretty age-friendly job because I have a lot of flexibility, right? So at EBOD, we so first of all, of course, in my job there's and all of our jobs, I would say, I think the physical effort that we have to put in. You maybe your wrist is getting a bit, overexposed from using your mouth, but that's a sort of the main thing. So I think that's for sure. Then the flexibility stuff, I would say, that differs quite a bit. And that is very much one organization we work in. So, but I think I would say on average, those are probably far flexible.
The more serious question is, how much can we substitute these so-called non-age-friendly jobs with robots or AI or whatever it is, with technology?
Yeah, so I think there's a correlation between I have a slide on that in a minute, but I don't think that's a perfect correlation, right? So I think there are a lot of jobs. So let's say an economist, an accountant, and a secretary might all be age-friendly jobs, but I think they have very different exposure towards AI. But they have very similar exposure to robotization. Right? So I think none of these jobs can be taken over by robots. Maybe a combination of robots and AI at some point, but I think, when we talk about robots more as sort of a physical force, I think that these would not be jobs where you would think that robots would have a big impact. But I think the perspective for AI to have an impact may differ from these jobs. I will pull out the side of that. But actually, we do next. Yeah, it's actually the next. So this is exactly what we do here. So basically, we look at a large group of occupations. Then each of the occupations we basically divide up by main tasks that people have to carry out. And then we basically look at each of these tasks and see whether this is a task that can be done by AI or in the near future can be done by agent. And then the question is, and so we follow some established literature here. Is this going to be sort of productivity enhancing? So are you becoming better? Am I becoming a better economist because I can now use AI for my coding or my writing? Or is AI so smart that it will actually do the job for me and I'm not out of the job? You won't see me here next year because the next transition report will be written today. In which case this would be not about complementarity, but about complete substitution. And so then we have these 4 quadrants. So one on the left, the gray ones are not that interesting because these are basically occupations where AI most likely is not going to have a major role. Robotization may, but not AI. But if you look on the right, you see that there's there are these green and orange occupations. And so like chief executives would be a good example where people may actually become more productive because they can implement AI in their work. Same for industrial engineers. But then there's also people like accountants, for instance, telemarketers, who are probably not going to be more effective because of AI, because AI is basically pretty much going to take over what they're doing. I think that is what's interesting here is nurses, to come back to your earlier question. So I think nurses is an example where both robotization and AI may actually have a big impact. And so in some leading countries, Japan would be a good example of that. You see that nurses are increasingly using AI to be more efficient in terms of they know exactly where to show up at a certain point in time, so they can deliver care when it's most needed. But at the same time, they can use smarter robots, for instance, to carry people into a bed or into a wheelchair.
Is it categorized as employee-friendly jobs or a non-employee?
I think nurses would not be an employee job. And I think for 2 reasons. I think nurses, you actually need quite a bit of body strength in many cases, and also I think it's a job that normally, that in many cases, is structured in a way that's not very flexible. So these working hours can be quite grueling, and there's very limited flexibility. So I think I would have to check, but I'm pretty sure this would not be an age-friendly job. It's a very tough job. The reason for doing that is, of course, not just to make this nice data plot, but then, of course, what you can do is you can look at different countries, see where people are currently working. So you look at the economic composition of the country, and you can basically see which countries are more at risk of large parts of their population being, well, either replaced or, as we call it slightly euphemistically here, there's pressure to reskill. So you might have to do something. Okay, so I'm going. What I'm going to do is I'm going to skip here. This is the 4th chapter. I'm not going to talk about it. I think it's an interesting chapter. And basically, the main point that we're making is that it's not only population that are aging very rapidly. In many countries, you also see that leaders are aging even faster. And that means that combined with the fact that younger people are often not voting, you get these, political economy systems where you have very old leaders, and you can think of your favorite example from any part of the world, very old leaders that might be much older than the average population. And then within the population, you see people on average getting older, and younger voters are voting less. So a lot of the decision making is actually going to be carried out by increasingly very rapidly older people, which will make it more difficult to push through some of these reforms that we that we talked about earlier on. Because that's the other thing that I would like to say. I mean, there's a slightly pessimistic note to end on, because none of these solutions that we talk about are typically very widely embraced by large masses of the population. Right? So people don't like massive immigration into the country. They don't like jobs being replaced by AI. They all want to retire already. And so you can go on and on and on. So I think just something has to give. And so making those decisions becomes more and more difficult if you have all the more risk averse population. So that's sort of a elevator pitch for the fourth chapter that you can really go on it. So I'm going to end you with a slogan that we have at the end. But the contract now, I think this is probably true with many things in life, but in particular the topic that we talked about today, I think it's a general information. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to take any questions, so remaining questions.
Actually, we take none.
As of today. Well, I mean, many of these things take time, right? So that pension reform will be, I think, a prime example where it just takes, and again, I can take Holland as an example where we've gone through a very lengthy process of redesigning the pension system and communicating that clearly, and that has taken, I think, 10, 15 years. So for countries that are not doing that yet, I think it's very important to start working on that. So that would be an obvious example. The other one would be anything related to, I would say, female labor force participation. I think that is slightly different because I think for two reasons. One, I think I'm actually quite optimistic. If you just look at the numbers, you can see that can, in many countries, can have a very big impact on sort of restabilizing the demographic makeup of the workforce. So it's a very powerful level to have. And it's also relatively easy. In principle, it's relatively easy, easier, I would say, than changing your pension system. Right? So just making sure that the institutions are organized in such a way that it becomes more attractive for women to become more part of the bigger part of the labor population. It's an easy way. Like Saudi Arabia would be the sort of stereotypical example where you go from complete exclusion. With the stroke of a pen, you can actually make it much easier for women to do certain tasks. Because when you go further to countries where the extreme is not an extreme, it becomes more difficult. Because then you have to think about childcare, you have to think about things like maternity leave, and then there's a whole cultural component which is not as easy to change from one day to another. So pension reform, I would say, would be a good one to start because that takes just such a long time for it to assess.
These two things that you just mentioned are within the legal boundary of a country. It's this kind of domestic policies.
It is, yes.
How about the labor migration issue?
Well, in principle, that of course, each country is in charge of its own borders, right? So I think unless a country signs up to a supranational agreement like the European Union, right? So if take the example of the UK, which because of migration, or mainly because of migration, someone got out of the UK, got out of the EU. That is still within the purview of a country, of a nation state to decide who gets to even visit or let alone live and work in a country. Of course, you can freely give up that and can say, okay, well, I'm going to be part of an international agreement where we allow for cross-border flows of labor, capital, and goods. But then you can always turn that back if your voters decide that is not improvement.
And one reason of why I'm asking this, because you have a very intriguing slides that this is a slide about the desired fertility rate.
Yeah, the blue and the red line. Yeah.
So if you look at the trends, you have more desired fertility than the actual.
Yes.
Or the three lowest deciles economies.
Yes.
And then you have more, less desired.
Yeah, so you have more kids than you want in
Exactly.
the poorer parts of the world, and you have fewer kids than you want.
If that situation is still globally, as an economist, of course, disregarding all, the norms and stuff like that.
Yeah, you see an arbitrage opportunity.
Yes.
Yes, no, of course, no, yeah.
It's not just arbitrage opportunity. I think the richest country needs to invest on child health and facilities and stuff in this lower income.
Yes.
Is to ensure that these kids will grow up as a productive.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I think there's a moral imperative to do that. But you're absolutely right. If it might be, smart policy to invest in other countries where in the future, well-educated people can come to a country to help you out. Absolutely.
Is there any movement to those international at all, or it's just something that's too naive to be?
No, I think of course, I think but I think the movement is the other way around. I mean, if you look at, okay, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think we know that some large countries that were traditionally donor countries that were investing a lot in international childcare and health have actually stopped doing that. So I think if there's a movement, it's actually in the other direction, which may not be the wisest policy, exactly for the reason that you are mentioning. The other thing, of course, that I want to say is that in itself may, the number of children that people are having in these poor countries, so the fact that the blue line is above the red one, might change once you actually start to invest in proper healthcare and childcare in this country, because once the likelihood that each individual child is going to survive the first 3-4 years of its life, you also see that the number of children quite rapidly is section. This is, the line that I was showing in terms of fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa, the reason why that is going down so quickly is exactly because there's been a lot of progress in terms of childcare and early life intervention. So people just they don't feel the need to have that many children because they know that more of the children that they're having will actually survive and can develop to adults.
I have one more question. I've been asking too much questions, so
No, go ahead.
to be honest.
So I need to.
I really enjoyed the conversation. The conversation is getting very interesting. That's why I couldn't stop. But formally, first let us stop. This we are out of work. But we will continue our discussion.
Yes.
So, to all the online participants, thank you so much for joining us today, and please join us again in our future events, and also those attending here in person. And thank you so much. Let's give a big round of applause to them.
Thank you very much.